Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the LCS RNet 13th annual meeting. LCS 14th? Sorry. Anyway, annual meeting. LCS RNet is an abbreviation of Leveraging Climate Neutral Society Strategic Research Network. And the name was changed from Low Carbon Society Research Network, but we use the same abbreviation LCS RNet. And we are working together to provide scientific knowledge to realize the climate neutral society or net zero societies. So this year, we focus on new scientific challenges for strengthening actions based on IPCC AR6. So I am Mikiko Kainuma from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and I serve as a Secretary General of this LCS RNet. I chair this opening plenary. Title is How Can We Trigger Transitions and Bridge Science with Actions. So first, I'll invite Mr. Genichiro Tsukada from Ministry of the Environment Japan for the opening remarks. So Mr. Tsukada, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Kainuma Sensei. Distinguished speakers and participants, on behalf of the Ministry of the Environment, the Government of Japan, I am very pleased to welcome all of you to this LCS RNet 13th annual meeting. The LCS RNet, established from a Japanese proposal at the 2008 G8 Environment Ministers meeting, is a network of researchers and research institutions closely involved in national climate policies. The Japanese Ministry of the Environment has been supporting LCS RNet activities from its inaugural stage. Next year, Japan will once again take up the G7 presidency, and the network celebrates its 14th anniversary, meaning that there have been 2 full rounds of the G7 rotation since its establishment. At this 13th annual meeting, the steering group members and the secretariat have selected a couple of overarching themes, as well as 4 issue-focused themes under the theme of new scientific challenges for strengthening actions based on IPCC AR6. The plenary sessions will discuss how to trigger transitions, how to bridge science with actions, and how to accelerate systemic transition and innovation. For the thematic sessions, the meeting features decarbonisation in agriculture and forestry, energy and food security, and also looks at the challenges facing heavy industries. All of these things must be tackled urgently if we are to achieve decarbonized societies. In addition, Japan has been promoting several initiatives through close relationships and collaboration between national and local governments. These include smart cities, digital garden cities, SDGs future cities, and zero carbon cities. One of the issues Japan would like to discuss at the upcoming G7 is how to promote and encourage actions by local governments around the world. Accordingly, one of the thematic sessions at this annual meeting will focus on a comparative study on zero carbon cities in France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK. We hope that this session will be an opportunity for the network of researchers established under the G8 framework to continue discussions on regional actions, leading to contributions at the G7 meeting. Personally, I believe that we need to think about what we should do with scientific findings, what kind of measures to take, and how fast we should proceed for the next step. In addition, we should use the wisdom and hints for progress that can be found in the IPCC reports and work together with a common aim. In this regard, I very much look forward to the discussions at this annual meeting. Finally, let me conclude my remarks by expressing my sincere hope that discussions at the sessions today and tomorrow will be successful and productive. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Tsukada. And thank you very much for your kind introduction of LCS RNet and also suggestions for our future work. It's a great pleasure to contribute to or provide scientific inputs to G7 meetings. Thank you. And next speaker is Dr. Frank Lecoq from Agro Paris Tech and International Research Center on Environment and Development, called CRET. He is a coordinating lead author of IPCC Working Group 3, AR6, Chapter 4, Mitigation and Development Pathways in the Near to Mid-Term. He will present the key insight from IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 and insist on the challenges raised by the shift in development pathways. So after about 20 minutes of presentation from Dr. Lecoq, we'll move on to Q&A. So if you have any questions, please write it in the chat box. So during his presentation, Q&A box or chat box? Q&A box. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So Frank, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody. Let me try and share my screen. Hopefully, this does work. Here we go. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Very good. So thank you very much for the introduction. So as was said before, we're lucky this year to have to be just after the release of the latest IPCC report, which first provides some basis on what we know and also what we don't know, so what we should be investigating more related to climate mitigation. And what I will try to do in the next 20 minutes is to briefly give you some insights coming from the report, and with a particular focus, as was said before, on development pathways and shifts in development pathways. First of all, I should be saying that even though just my name appears on the screen, I am far from being alone, and I'm not the only author here. Obviously, I'm speaking on behalf of 278 scientists who have worked on this Working Group 3 report, so the report on mitigation, including Dr. Masui, who will be speaking next. So by no means this is only me here. Also, as an introduction, I would like to maybe emphasize that the report is out there. Whatever I can say in 20 minutes will be just scratching the surface. And I would really like to encourage everybody to go and read the report. There's a lot of material there that is still very relevant. It was published only a couple of months ago. There's really a lot of work for 4 years of all these people that have gone into preparing this work. And so I would really encourage you to go and get into it, not just on the summary for policymaker, but also on the technical summary, which is an extended summary, and to go deep into the chapters, the 17 chapters themselves. There are a lot of signposts and indications. It's also very easy to search for keywords in the PDF files, and I would, if you just keep one message from this talk, is please keep this one. Now, let me give you a couple of ideas on what's what are the key messages from the report. The first is that despite really set of good news from the extended much more climate. Many more climate policies being put in place. We have still seen greenhouse gas emissions grow over the past decade, and we've reached an all-time high in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The cutoff date for our data was 2019, but unfortunately, more recent data do not seem to have just changed that particular that pattern. So obviously, we are, despite the slowing down in the growth of emissions, we are not on track to reaching to the Celsius, or to keeping global warming below 2°C, let alone 1.5. If one looks then in the future, towards the future, well, the scale of what we need to do if we want to be consistent with the objectives taken by the international community is quite impressive. In red here on the figure, you see the scenarios that are sort of without additional climate policies. So what we might see, the range of, if we do not do anything more than we do already on climate mitigation. And those scenarios tend to be sort of muddled through, meaning the emissions continue to grow very, very slowly, and they might start even decreasing after 2050. But in any case, that leads us to global warming of largely more than 2 degrees and close to 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. By contrast, if one wanted to get to 1.5, well, one then needs to follow the emissions trajectories that are in the blue range, so at the bottom of the figure. And as you can see, that's a huge effort by 2030, nearly cutting down CO2 emissions by nearly half relative to 2019, and even reducing also emissions from other greenhouse gases, in particular methane. But even if one wants to keep greenhouse gas emissions below 2 degrees Celsius, there's also a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions quite strongly by about a quarter relative to 2019 in 2030. That's the green set of scenarios that you can see here. Obviously, what matters, at least in the first order, for long-term for the global warming is the total amount of carbon dioxide that is being emitted in the atmosphere. So basically the area below the curve. So you could get to 2°C by reducing less in the short run, but by accelerating very rapidly in the long run, and that's the like the dark blue shade, the dark blue paths here. We put those in the graph because what you see on the dark blue paths between 2020 and 2030 is basically what we can expect from the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, if they are indeed put in place. So if, as you can see, the NDCs, they would yield a reduction in emissions relative to business as usual. So that's an effort. However, that effort is remains at the time very small relative to the pathways that lead you to 2°C and let alone 1.5. You could still be on track but that would require very rapid and drastic emission reductions after 2030 at a rate that is unprecedented in history. So the plausibility of which is quite debatable. The other element, if you look forward, is that, as you know, to stabilize global warming, one needs to reach net zero CO2, meaning a balance between remaining greenhouse CO2 emissions and removals. The faster the smaller we want to keep temperature, here one needs to reach net zero around 2050 for 1.5C, around 2070 for the whole world for 2C. Now the IPCC has spent quite a lot of time looking at the different options for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions across sectors. And the key message is that there are options available, not science fiction, available now in every sector that can, if combined together, could halve emissions by 2030 relative to 2019. So that's, I think, a very important point. Of course, these options well, saying that this option exists is not by no means means that this is easy, because one has to implement them simultaneously in all sectors. There's not one single sector that just can that can solve the problem, and those options are also both on the supply side, so technology, for instance, renewables, and also on the demand side, so changes in demand, changes in the organization of supply chains, things like that. And it's the combination of all this that does provide the potential. The report at length in sort of exploring for sector by sector all these options. I'm not going to go into this now because it's because of time. We can come back if there are questions. What I would like to show simply here is another view of that mitigation potential. It's a figure that is in the summary for policymaker, and that provides for each sector or system, and within each sector for each of option, what the literature says about the costs of mitigation for each of these options and their potentials. This is sort of estimated based on bottom-up literature, option by option. I'm showing this graph to show you that there are two things. One is that, as you can see, there's not one big, huge bar, which would one option that would have the potential to solve the whole problems. It's a combination that you need to work on. Two, however, that if you sort of sum up all these things, there's enough potential at cost that is reasonable, meaning below $100 per ton CO2. So that's a second message. And the third is that you also see a lot of bars where they are blue colors. The blue meaning that the costs are lower than the reference, negative cost of mitigation. Does it mean? It means simply that it would be cost effective to implement some of these options anyway. And if they are not implemented or put in place, it's because there are other barriers somewhere. For instance, institutional, for instance, light bulbs, efficient light bulbs may be more expensive to buy, but more cost effective during the whole duration of the whole lifetime of the bulb. If you don't have information, you will buy them, or if you don't have the cash in hand, you will buy the cheapest light bulb, even though it will be more costly for you all the time. So then you have to provide information, and maybe you have to provide cash to help people buy the right option. So the blue bars don't mean there's nothing to do, but there are institutional barriers or some barriers that you have to identify to sort of unlock this potential. Then the report spends a lot of time looking at the sort of enabling conditions for all these actions to take place. Obviously, you need policies, and the important point here is that policies and regulations, we now have some experience back from what works and what does not, and that's an important point. And here again, in terms of action, it's not just putting policies in place, but also removing institutional barriers that are often impede action. For instance, lack of coordination between national, regional, and local level that makes it much more difficult to implement mitigation policies. You also need finance, and I know that there will be discussions on that tomorrow. The key idea message being current flows towards mitigation are insufficient. There are savings available. There is money available, private money out there. The key question is to direct it towards mitigation, a little more towards mitigation or clean projects. And finally, well, the report spends quite a lot of time looking at the relationship between mitigation and other goals, because obviously what we're talking about is so large that it cannot but have implications for other development objectives. Here, the key point is that if you look at the economic impacts of mitigation, they tend to be in general modest relative to baseline GDP growth or baseline GDP assumptions. However, depending a lot on sectors and regions, and depending a lot on the nature of the policy you put in place. So it's not, those costs are not carved in stone, but it really depends on what you do. And there's a careful is something that is really important here. Similarly, for jobs, job impact tend to be sort of slightly negative, or even in some cases, in some studies, slightly positive. But obviously, once you've said that, you've said nothing, because what really matters is the transition. How do you put people from jobs in dirty sectors that are being closed to back to jobs in clean sectors where they are being created? And that's an issue for training, that's an issue for regional policies, and that's the whole just transition discussion. The report finally spends quite a lot of time looking at the co-benefits of adaptation and mitigation, for other sustainable development goals. There's a whole chapter dedicated to that, and with a lot of studies sort of pointing towards synergies between mitigation and other development goals. But what I would like to finish with is something we've been working on, particularly in the chapter that I've co-coordinated, is the converse, is how working on other development goals might also be beneficial for and help accelerate mitigation. The idea here is that patterns of development, they structure greenhouse gas emissions and your ability to mitigate. If a country is specialized, obviously, what in type of industries a country is specialized into will shape its energy demand. Spatial patterns of development, they will determine your demand for housing, demand for transport, etc., etc. So that there are elements, the way you develop and your development patterns do structure for a large part your greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what we see is that I was talking about barriers to mitigation before, is that current development patterns, they often make mitigation more difficult. On the left side is a map of Paris and the traffic around Paris on an average day, and all the reds are just traffic jams. And the example here, what I want to illustrate here is the idea, is one example of how development patterns may make mitigation more difficult. Here, spatial development in cities. In many places, we see that decreasing affordability of inner city neighborhoods is a major cause of suburbanization. Increasing rents, push households farther and farther away from city centers. And as jobs do not follow suit, basically it means higher demand for higher commute time, higher demand for transport, and higher emissions. If you want to mitigate, so if you put policies, a carbon tax or whatever to try and reduce your emissions, well, you have to go against that force that pushes people outward. Now, that development pattern, that spatial development pattern, but in general, any development pattern, is not something that is sort of carved in stone. Again, that's something that can change over time. And we have in our chapter looked in detail at shifts, examples of shifts in development past shifts in development pathways, how intentional shifts in development pathways. And here, with the idea that changing your development patterns might help and facilitate mitigation. If I go back to the example, my city example, well, if you make housing close to jobs more affordable, for instance, via housing policies, fiscal policies, zoning policies, whatever, that will limit the demand for transport. That would also make, and therefore reduce your greenhouse gas emission, associated greenhouse gas emissions. That would also make public transportation of softer transport modes more cost effective. Obviously, if your city is denser, it's easier or more cost effective to put in place a bus line or metro or whatever. And in that case, the same climate policy instrument, the same level, a carbon tax at the same level, would have a much greater impact on your emissions than if you're in a world where you keep pushing your households outward. And on the left-hand side, I don't have well, there's been research, including in our lab, looking at how indeed you can basically trade off between the level of a carbon tax and action on housing prices to reach the same environmental goal. The idea is that shifting development pathways towards sustainability, SDPS on the top of this slide, also can help broaden the policy debate. The idea is that, well, societies have many development objectives and goals, not just climate mitigation, even though this is obviously a critical element. And it's very good to talk about the co-benefits of mitigation, but it's also, I think, important to start from, for some people at least, start from other development objectives that people really care about. And obviously, affordability of housing close to your job is one element that people care about. And say, okay, maybe if you care about affordable housing, well, in fact, if you do it right, you're making it easier to mitigate. So that's so that's a good thing. Continue doing that, and then we can that also helps mitigation. Let me conclude by saying that of course, this is also challenges because it broadens the scope, in particular beyond traditional climate policy instruments. You're talking about housing policies, zoning, and things like that are not typically associated with climate change. So it makes things maybe more complicated, but also in terms of political economy, makes things well easier, at least to find compromises between different policies. At least this is one element that sort of comes out of the report, and the last slide is on a quote from the summary for policy maker of the report, that really emphasizes the role of shifting development pathways as a complement to accelerating the more traditional in climate policy instruments, and as also something that can be in the basket of things to do now to help not only reduce emissions immediately, but facilitate accelerating the reduction in emissions down the road. With this, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your informative presentation. And yeah, we can it's very helpful to understand these future pathways. And I don't have any questions and answers from the audience. So so during that, I will want to ask you a few questions, but during I was asking, please write Q&A, your questions here, Q&A boxes. So yeah, I have, have many questions actually, but for you pointed, and there are many options available now. And also, the AR6 report shows the many feasible scenarios and also enabling conditions. But my understanding that enabling conditions still require actions to be realized. So what kind of research is needed to realize the enabling conditions? Are you already told us that the combination of supply side and demand side is very important. But if we focus specific issues, for example, this demand side technologies, including involvement of citizens, or technology development, or policies such as pricing or financing issues. So this is my question. Yeah.
Thank you. On the enabling conditions, so indeed the report spends a lot of time trying to look at the different conditions necessary to put in place the different options that have been identified. The broad categories, I mean, obviously you need policies, you will need finance, you will need innovation. There are institutions, good institutions slash governance in general. The broad categories. In terms of research priorities, one key element, I think, two elements in my view. One is clearly it's finance, where, as I said before, chapter 15, the chapter that is dedicated to finance in the report, identifies very important gaps in terms of financing for transition. And there's really a need to find innovative ways by which and find and implement innovative and credible ways by which one can redirect part of the global savings towards low carbon projects, not only domestically, but there's also an international element here, as savings and might be available, might be not available in all countries where mitigation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. And I have a question from the audience, and I will repeat it. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Do we have information in the latest IPCC report which could help us understand why policymakers are not taking enough attention and actions to shift development pathways and enable those related systemic changes you mentioned? So a little bit difficult question.
Two things. One, I think what the report shows is that there's quite a lot of policies already put in place. So there is action at policy level in many countries. About half of the emissions in the world are under some form of climate policy. So one has to be careful to say that first. Second, I think the difficulty here is that when you broaden the scope, as we've done, it's also a bit more difficult to see the relationship with mitigation. Typically, the mitigation or it's the Ministry of Environment that has been in charge of looking at climate change. Other ministries may not think that this is, or may not think enough, but this is also their part of their mandate, if you wish. This is certainly changing now, or evolving, and I'm certainly not saying that this is true everywhere, but I guess that's really one of the major hurdles towards looking at systemic solutions. On the other hand, what we're finding is that those systemic changes are really important and critical in many places to remove some of the barriers that impede mitigation.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a few minutes. So I have also, I have another question is about the, you talked about this supply side and demand side. And also my question is about the mitigation and the impact and adaptation. So I think it's very difficult to analyze simultaneously this mitigation and adaptation issues. But many people say that our scenarios should more clearly say that not only the cost of mitigation, but the cost that could be saved if we do such kind of pathways. So do you think that such kind of co-benefits or such kind of this adaptation cost can be included in these scenarios?
Okay. The putting together the cost of mitigation and the impacts, the costs associated with the impacts of climate change, and so the benefits of mitigating, not incurring these costs, is something that remains, I think, one of the research frontiers today, if only because the channels by which mitigation will impact the economy are very different from the channels by which climate change will impact on the economy. The latter are multiple channels, very different depending on the regions and countries, a lot of uncertainties associated with them. And so putting all this together into sort of one broad cost-benefit analysis of the climate problem is conceptually very nice, but in practice quite difficult. However, first, there are more and more studies, more teams, modeling teams working in that direction. Many sectoral studies, and they are referenced in the chapter, also do take into account the potential impacts of climate change on the mitigation potential. Obviously, obvious for sequestration. I mean, if you biomass burn because there's a forest fire, then you have released everything. But it's true in the energy sector, etc. So there's more and more literature, sectoral literature, that takes this into account. Third, the report also looks in detail at the literature on cost-benefit analysis, because there is one, and it shows clearly that the literature shows that for at least scenarios that keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, the benefits in terms of avoided impact outweigh the cost of mitigation, and that's a robust finding from the literature.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're almost at the time, but may I just one question is there are so many levels of scenarios: global, regional, national, subnational. So if we focus more on the policy side, we need to more the subnational scenarios and many scenarios. But what do you think the difficulty to put together these subnational scenarios from global to subnational scenarios? Which scenarios do you think this important? Or I think, of course, those of course we need to develop those several level scenarios, but do you think that this we had better to more develop subnational scenarios?
Yes, I think it is. And in terms of, if you look at the landscape, global scenarios, there's a community that is well established, that is
Yes.
producing scenario. Of course, there are many things one can improve, but at least there's a very strong basis at the national and even more at the subnational level. The landscape is much more complicated. We've tried in our chapter, and Dr. Masui we've been working together on that. We try to assemble a database of national level scenarios, just like the database of global level scenarios that is used by chapter 3, the chapter on long-term mitigation pathways. But essentially, we failed, or at least we did not have a database that could be exploitable the same way as the database of global scenarios. Why? Because there are two reasons. Many countries, many teams within many countries, and not an organized, not really an organized, it's difficult just to identify who has produced national scenarios. Two, many of, and it's two, comparability. Obviously, national scenarios will be done under many contexts and many assumptions about the rest of the world. So it's even if you have the data, it's very difficult to compare or draw information. Three, sorry, it's not 2 points, but 3 points. Also, many of the scenarios that are politically relevant within countries are not in peer-reviewed literature. In the French case, for instance, the low carbon national strategy, Stratégie nationale bas carbone, our plan for 2050 is unpublished. Scenarios and a lot of other scenarios by public agencies that are really relevant in the public debate, they are not published in peer-reviewed literature. So they are. So with all these hurdles, it was impossible to assemble that database. What I think really, but I really think it is essential to work at these levels, because those are the level where you can really look in detail at the national circumstances, the details of the policy, of fiscal policies, the details of the sectors or whatever. Also, that's the level where stakeholders and they see themselves in the not within aggregate, but so that's really again that's a very strong important frontier in research.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you pointed out many useful information. You give us a very wonderful and informative presentation and pointed out many issues, including mitigation and sustainable development or development patterns, co-benefits and financing issues and so on. So I do hope that we can continue to work together to provide scientific knowledge to realize climate neutral society. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I close this session.
Okay, maybe we can start the right time. Yes,
you can start.
Okay, thank you. So welcome to the session 1 of the Low Carbon Society Research Network annual meeting, and our session will focus its attention on agriculture and forestry and land use, and try to understand how we can reach mitigation goals by or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well by increasing the role of vegetation and soils in CO2 absorption. To deal with this important argument, we invited 2 speakers, that will have a main speech dealing with the specific issues. And then we will have a panel of discussion, and we invited you discussion that will interact with the speakers, and also will add some relevant issues according to their specific experiences. My name is Nicola Colonna. I work at Enea. Enea is the National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development. I'm an agronomist as a background. I work also on the role between agriculture, energy, and environment. And I will chair the session, try to organize and providing the right time for all the people involved. Before to start, I just would like to briefly introduce some relevant point of view about the fact that when we are speaking about mitigation policies and strategies in our specific sector, we can see the two different point of view: decreasing emission and or increasing CO2 absorption. And to deal with this, we have some relevant point that we have to discuss. First of all, agriculture and forestry can provide energy and consume energy. This is one point. Another relevant issue is we have in front of us the potential for long-term storage in soils and biomass. But what are the long-term effects of this capacity if we are going to increase it? And then which could be the role of circular bioeconomy in being able to provide a strong contribution to mitigation objectives. Here I just show you some anthropogenic emissions over 3 decades. And we can see that if we put together agriculture and land use change and forestry, they are quite relevant in terms of contribution to the total anthropogenic emission. So we have to deal with these specific sectors to understand how they can effectively provide a contribution to the overall goals of mitigation. And there are still many open questions. You can see here where we are with agriculture, forestry, and land use change. And we try to address this point with the first speaker. And also what kind of, do we have knowledge gaps that we have to close because we have to better understand what is going on? And what kind of a limitation, or we can say also constraints, if we would like to make a policies, for example, to increase the amount of carbon storage in soils and biomass, and what could be the long-term effects or overall equilibrium of our planet. So we have many different issues in front of us to discuss this and other relevant point. We invited as a first speaker Mr. Francesco Tubiello. Francesco Tubiello is a senior statistician and a climate change specialist, especially focused on agriculture and land use. He works at the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome. He is the head of the environmental statistics section in FAO, and he has been lead author of International Panel on Climate Change since the 4th assessment report. So please, Dr. Francesco Tubiello, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Please confirm that you hear me.
Yes, please remember 15 minutes. Thank you.
Yes. And also please confirm that my presentation is on the screen.
Right now, no, I'm waiting for.
Oh, hold on just 1 second. I need to share it, and I will do that right away.
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Okay,
Maybe
so
you have
thank
to
you very,
enlarge. Okay. Okay.
thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to this important meeting. Good afternoon to the people in Japan, and good day to everyone else who's following around the world. I will present really briefly a sort of bird's eye view of where emissions from AFOLU thought of as the sum of agriculture and LULUCF that was shown in the pies that Nicola you showed earlier. But because I come from FAO, and this is becoming now quite important also in terms of understanding how this fits into the circular economy, put this into the context of agri-food systems to provide the overarching view of the moving parts of all these components. So first and foremost, what do we mean by food systems? At least this is the view that we like to focus on, you know, from an FAO, Food and Agriculture organization, international organization. So it's quite simple and complicated at the same time. It encompasses the entire process from production on the field within the farm, so the crops and livestock, which generate mostly non-CO2 gases, methane and N2O. It extends to the boundaries around the farm, especially in countries where economies are still transforming. So there is a lot of pressure, let's say, towards natural ecosystems, and therefore impinging on you know, impinging on natural land for increasing production. So these are all the processes related to deforestation, if you will, drainage of peatlands, tropical peatlands, and so on and so forth, fires. But it also includes the food, the retail chain, if you will, right? The food supply chain. So once the food leaves the farm gate, all the processes that have to do with processing and transport and retailing, and of course then all the way to household consumption and food disposal, right? So these are, it's a much larger view than the one that we are typically used to when we talk about AFOLU, for example. Many of you might be more familiar with this view, but they are, you know, I wouldn't call them alternative views. They're certainly complementary. The IPCC view representing, of course, the climate policy lens to interpret these processes. And so what we usually have is a process where countries report their information on national greenhouse gas inventories, and they do this across 4 so-called IPCC sectors, right? Which in a sense mask this holistic view that I just presented. And so some of the work we are engaged in FAO, but also in collaboration with the European Union, is to provide a mapping between the information that it's in the national greenhouse gas inventory and information that might be more relevant to a concept of food systems, so that, you know, the basic idea is that when countries look at their NDCs, right, their national mitigation plans, their national determined contributions, which are based on the inventory, with a mapping like this, they could relate some of the action more closely to what it means for their food systems at the national level. And there are, you know, 2 simple linkages to be had. I mean, AFOLU, in a sense, is linked to the processes I mentioned before, the production within the farm gate, and the one on land use and land use change. Whereas there are a lot of food system processes that you wouldn't see in the national greenhouse gas inventory, because all you would see is energy, industry, and waste processes, which instead relate to food nonetheless, and entail all the things and many more that I've alluded to before, including what we call pre-production processes, for example, fertilizer manufacturing, right? On-farm energy use, which is reported in the national greenhouse gas inventory, not in agriculture, but Nicola, you mentioned it very nicely before, agriculture in the farm is in fact also an emitter of CO2. It's just that if you go in the IPCC National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, you wouldn't know that. But as agronomists and as farmers, people are very well aware that that's an important component. Now, with that view in mind, and because I don't have too much time, and hopefully we can expand on this during the discussion, I will just go over a few of the highlights that come from the recent analysis that we've made, which have contributed to the most recent AR6, both chapter 7, which is on a follow, but also chapter 12 that deals with some of these holistic processes. As well as a process that started, in fact, with the special report on land and climate change, which introduced or expanded, because this is a process that's been going on for decades, but expanded on the concept of food systems. So what comes out of this analysis is that whereas AFOLU, as a share in the global emissions that has been decreasing over time, but still important, let's say today in 2020, probably more around 15% than the 20% that was shown for 2010. Once you put in place the entire view of food systems, you can see that this is weighting for about 30% to the total emissions, 30% of all man-made emissions in the atmosphere. And this has been picked up by many papers over the last 2 years, including the point that, to get to net zero, or in any case to an effective mitigation strategy in the coming decades, you cannot avoid but working within this system as well. And you see that the share of emissions has been decreasing over time. It was about 40%, in fact, in the year 2000, or 39, 40% in 2000. It went down to about 31% today. And this is simply a reflection of the fact that some of the emissions in this category are, let's say, quite stable, certainly not growing as the ones from CO2 fossil fuels. Although there are some important clarifications that I'm making in my presentation. So, a quick overview of the main finding. I already touched upon the first part. Emissions from the farm gate, and keep in mind that we include here also the CO2 from energy, cover about half of all food systems emissions. Land use change, which has been decreasing over time, especially after trends in Latin America, which hopefully get confirmed over the next decade, but it certainly decreased since the year 2000. Excuse me, a bit of a cold. Are only a fifth now of the process. And pre and post-production processes, so in the entire supply chain, these are mostly CO2 emissions, are becoming increasingly important, and they count for about a third of all emissions from food systems. Now, one of the things that we like to do in the databases that we put forward is to provide a subcomponent view of how these emissions are made. And this is not necessarily, the final, well, it has value in informing on mitigation strategies from the perspective of providing a picture of how things stand today, right? Where does it make more sense to mitigate vis-a-vis the relative importance of a system over another? This is the global picture. Keep in mind, of course, that this changes, especially between developing and developed countries. But what it shows is, well, first of all, some of the things we know very well. So the weight of livestock in the global pie is the methane, mostly from enteric fermentation, from ruminant animals. The still important role of net forest, well, this is deforestation. We call it net forest conversion for a number of statistical reasons, but for the sake of this presentation, you can think of it as deforestation. But also the important role of all these CO2, fossil fuel related processes along supply chains, which are becoming more important and growing exponentially since in a sense, if you think about it, the verticalization of food producers and suppliers, right? The big rise over the last 30 years of supermarket or the super food production and distribution chains. Together with this picture, which includes food systems, so food systems don't necessarily include what happens on forests, that it's more has to do with forestry production, wood production, and other products. But just to provide a sense of the weight that a carbon sequestration on land might have in this group is, estimates of the carbon forest sink, which of course is very uncertain, and we can talk about that in the panel discussion. But let's say, at least based on the data we receive from countries at FAO, it's between 2 and 3 billion tons of CO2 per year currently. Now, so there are many important data gaps, which I'm not going to touch in the presentations. First and foremost, of course, the uncertainty in the emission factors that we use to estimate all of the components that we've shown before. There's a lot of gaps into assessing emissions along the supply chain, which is a relatively new effort, where in fact FAO and the European Commission have sort of led the way, if you will, over the last 2 years, but with a lot of work that needs to be done in working with countries in refining those coefficients, just like the IPCC did for AFOLU over the last 20 plus years. But some of the fundamental gaps come directly from the data the countries provide themselves to the Climate Convention, in which of course we and other groups use to assess the goodness and robustness of our estimates. So you see, the clear, well-known picture between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 parties to the convention. Annex 1 parties, of course, being developed OECD-type countries, non-Annex 1 parties being developing countries and emerging economies. So you see, the reporting in Annex 1 countries is complete and allows for, a fair comparison of estimates that also attempt to be complete for this group of countries. And you see here for the yellow-red part, yellow are the estimates that we make at FAO for emissions from agriculture versus what the countries report themselves. And the same thing happens for, in this case, the forest sink. So providing a good sense for the usefulness of some of the estimates that are made, to derive global and regional information. And the same is, of course, cannot be said for non-Annex 1 countries. I have to say the picture, of course, is improving increasingly with the push towards better informing NDCs, BURs, etc. But nonetheless, the reporting from countries in this group is so incomplete that the comparison between what we estimate for the group as a full country and what the countries report is really not possible. So you see very large gaps here, but the gaps are mostly due to the fact that the UNFCCC bars are incomplete. Okay, so I just wanted to point this out, especially also from an FAO perspective. We work with member countries in trying to improve their capacity in producing data, and we're still far away in that direction to be able to put together sufficient amount of information to then make robust decisions. Now, I just want to close with a couple of observations on the results that we have generated. So this is a graph that shows a regional picture, including trends over time from 1990 to today, to recently, showing the 3 components of the food system. So you see the yellow is the farm, then the green is the land use change, mostly deforestation, with some peatland degradation and fires. And the blue part is actually the supply chain. And you see that, well, you see a couple of things. Like we noticed before, the emissions from land are decreasing globally. That's a good sign, although there's a lot more that needs to be done and especially maintained over time to ensure that this is the good path that we are on continues. But as long as we are considering a follow as a subcomponent of food systems, we need to become increasingly concerned about the fast rise of emissions from this part of the food chain, which are becoming not only, it's growing more than the other components, but they are progressively becoming the most important component. Certainly it's true, it's already become true in Europe and North America, but it's also true in Asia. And of course, much less in other parts of the world, although the relative trends are the same. Now, good and bad news about this picture is that although the emissions from supply chains are becoming increasingly important, they are largely CO2 fossil fuel emissions. And therefore, within the confidence that we have that we will decarbonize our economy soon, potentially those will not, over the next 2-3 decades, become less of a problem, or at least something that we can hope to address from a mitigation perspective more efficiently. Emissions from LULUCF are decreasing. This is mostly the component on deforestation. Now, the carbon sink on forest is substantial. There is a lot of debate on exactly what is the entity of it. I'm happy to discuss this during the panel. But let's keep in mind that the potential to mitigate is limited for a number of reasons, including saturation. So we cannot really look at it as, sort of the panacea for offsetting the rest of the emissions. And then, the usual discussion when it comes to food and particularly farm production is that farms emit the bulk of non-CO2 that we as humans put into the atmosphere. And there's a lot that can be done, but it's also, it's a process linked to feeding ourselves. So it's a huge challenge, part of which will need to be addressed by making agriculture increasingly more efficient. Producing more food or the same amount of food with less inputs potentially. So with that, Nicola, I thank you. I hope I stayed within a lot of time.
Thank you, Francesco, for your clear presentation, also to help us to set in the stage with data, information, and also gaps. That is another important and relevant issues. So let's start with the second part of our session. I invite you to open the video for Mrs. Carina Larsen. I will briefly introduce her. Carina Larsen is a Global Operation Manager at the Climate Technology Center and Network of United Nations. And she's responsible for the Climate Technology Center knowledge sharing and communication strategies. She also leads some technology programs for gender, indigenous peoples, and youth. And she will introduce us to what they're doing. And at the same time, we will move from the data to the action, what they're really doing on the ground, and what they can really do to reach the goals that we know we have in front of us. So please, Carina, the floor is yours. You can share your screen, and please remember 15 minutes, no more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, now it's perfect. I can hear and see. Okay.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so greetings to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about the CTCM's work in this area. And let me just see here. Hold on. I'm working from a different computer, and It's a little tricky to see. Yeah, now you should see the agenda. So I'll cover a couple of areas of a couple aspects of the things that we're discussing today. And first, I just wanted to start with a brief introduction of the Climate Technology Center Network for those who may not be familiar. The CTCN is actually part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we are under what is known as the technology mechanism. So we are the implementing arm on technology, and we work side by side with the finance mechanism, which you may know includes the Green Climate Fund, for example, and the GEF. And we have been working since 2014, and a large part of the work that we do is respond to requests for technical assistance in technology. And here you can see that we've had approximately even a little bit more than 365 requests from over 102 countries around the world since we've started. And the areas that we cover are quite broad across adaptation and mitigation technologies. So everything from agriculture and forestry to industry, transport, waste management, and everything that falls in between. And when we work on technology, it's not just on the hard technologies, but also the methodologies, the planning tools, capacity building, and a lot of the organizational aspects, such as policy work. And here you can see a little bit about the types of requests that we get. So we don't have as much requests as some might think on piloting of technologies, but a lot of times it's more on providing the types of decision-making information that's needed, or guidance on policy, regulatory environments, and so forth. Here at the last COP, we actually launched our new program of work for the next several years. We still remain very much open to any kinds of requests from countries, especially those that support their nationally determined contributions. But some of the main focuses that we have for the path going forward will be on both national systems of innovation, really trying to help support the building of those in countries, and the use of digitalization in technologies. We'll continue to work across a broad array of sectors, but here you can see some of the 5 where we really feel like that we can have the most impact. And of course, always looking at the broad group of stakeholders that need to be involved in decision-making and implementation of technologies. Now, looking a little bit about relevant technologies and some of the barriers related to both agriculture and technology, here I've listed just a sample of some of the types of actions and methods that we're often receiving requests on. And then the technology solutions which fall under these areas. So this is not a complete picture of the types of actions that can be taken in this area, but some of the ones that we receive a large number of requests on. And in the work that we've done over the last several years, we've also been gathering information about what are some of the key barriers that we're seeing in the countries that we serve in terms of both developing new technologies, but also implementing and really deploying them on a greater scale. And as it might not be surprising to you, one of the top ones is the lack of information and awareness. Even when countries have some strong policies, a lot of times the information has not been disseminated to the extent that people can really use it in terms of their agricultural practices. There's also, of course, the barriers to financing, especially for small land holders in terms of agriculture, and a risk aversion to trying to access financial institutions. There are a lot of capacity elements that come into the barriers, and here you can see some of the other issues, but these are some of the things that we really are trying to address in terms of the work that we're doing, and to build better environments for the development and use of these technologies. So I thought I would start by sharing some examples that we have in areas of both agroforestry and agriculture. And starting first with agroforestry, we have a project that we had completed in Belize on development of a national agroforestry policy. A lot of the requests, as I mentioned, that we receive from countries are at the national level, really looking at how to inform better policy making to collect the data that's needed, and also to help in the dissemination and capacity building to use the information contained in these policies. And so a lot of the situation in Belize was looking at the smallholder sort of subsistence farming, and trying to look at that perspective and how to best guide the policy work that could take place. And so there was a review of existing policies. And also, we really try to encourage knowledge sharing within a region and also across regions. And so in this case, we facilitated meetings between the government of Belize and Costa Rica, which had a slightly more developed policy and more experience that they could share from the past few years. And so one thing to note is that a lot of times we can inform the development of policies, but they still have to go through a process of approval in the government's policymaking areas. And so, so sometimes we don't, we're not able to we can inform but not control, of course, the situation. And so sometimes these policies are taken up, and other times there's a change in government, and so they don't get carried through or they get amended. But this particular policy is seen to potentially benefit, once it's completely implemented, 160,000 inhabitants in rural areas, and to increase the current forest cover by approximately 800,000 hectares. And a similar issue we looked at was in Nepal, where there were some policies in place, but they were not cohesive in terms of sort of an overarching policy, and it was very difficult to access information on these policies. And with an increasing risk from climate change of both water-induced events, both drought and flooding, landslides and other things, there was really a sense that their policies needed to be updated to really enhance the use of agroforest policies. So here we looked at the existing policies, conducted a review, and worked with a wide range of stakeholders to develop a new national agroforestry policy. And the aim here was really to ultimately increase resilience in this sector, but also to link it to some of the other areas that can motivate people to engage in this sector. So our increased income enhancement, and also the engagement of various stakeholder groups that might not have been able to be involved in this sector in the past. And finally, similarly, we worked in Kenya to create a 10-year national agroforestry plan. Here, there was a similar situation. There was really no strategic guidance in place, and there was a difficulty in finding an institutional home. What ministry should take on this work and help to disseminate the information? And so we looked at the current policies and really did an extensive consultative process across ministries, across regional and local areas to define what the needs were and how it could be best made into more of a consistent plan that could be implemented. And so this one has been taken forward, and we're monitoring now to see how it's being implemented through various stages of the government. Now, looking at some of the technical assistance requests that we've had on agriculture, a lot of interest has come about looking at both climate smart agriculture and increasingly looking at the relationship between adaptation and mitigation in the agricultural sector. And so in this particular case, there was a low level of awareness of climate change in itself, and also how to implement climate smart technologies, even what were those technologies. And so working with partners in the region, we evaluated what technologies might be the most useful in this particular context, and what systems would need to be in place to really both improve agricultural production, but also to look at how to incorporate greenhouse gas emission mitigation benefits in terms of the work. In Vietnam, we received a request regarding focus on rice production, which was one of the predominant areas of focus in Vietnam's national determined contribution as a target for mitigation. And so here we developed some interactive tools to help calculate the costs and benefits for various actions that could be taken to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions in the rice sector, and also looking at some geographic information system mapping techniques that could be utilized to gather information for making the best decision making in the area. And so utilizing that, and then the creating greater awareness of the types of technologies and methods that could be used. We worked with the government also to help disseminate this information. And then in Mozambique, looking at issues of water scarcity, droughts, and the low energy access in general, and how some of these things could be improved to create a more stable agricultural system, but also trying to steer away from things like gas generators for irrigation, and looking more into solar powered technologies that could be utilized, while at the same time looking at some financing mechanisms that would be helpful for smallholder farmers, and in particular looking at women's engagement in the agricultural sector at this level, and how to really engage and empower them in terms of these irrigation systems and the small solar powered activities. I would say a lot of the work that we do in technical assistance is also based upon capacity building, but I wanted to highlight sort of two particular areas of capacity building that we have worked on. In Zimbabwe, there was also a lot of interest in climate smart agriculture and really disseminating information on this at a broad level. And so we developed actually a manual upon their request for agricultural education, both at the university level, but also at the level of extension schools around the country. And this was quite a comprehensive manual, and also included considerations that need to be made for various stakeholder groups and how to really engage people. And here it has been disseminated already across the country. And the idea is, as we did sort of at the end of this process, a train the trainer exercise throughout the country, that it will hopefully be able to continue to spread in terms of the information sharing at more local levels. And finally, actually happening this week as we speak, we're working on a digital technology program for the agricultural sector. This is being held in Korea, and really trying to introduce the use of digital technologies in the agriculture and larger food production system. So sharing some of the latest technologies and how they're being used, but also looking at how countries can co-create activities and technical assistance ideas, requests that could come through us. And so this is working with both the private sector, with universities, and the government, and a number of different countries, I think 15 in total here. And so we're hoping to learn a lot from this particular training, and to see how the experience of these participants might be able to be shared more broadly in other regions as well. So I'll stop here, and I'll happy to take any questions that you may have about the CTCN assistance in general, the process, or on the technology related to agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina, to be the right time, also to be so clear, and to show us the type of actions in which CTCN is involved, the barriers to the different kind of goals we would like to reach. Also, how much is important the lack of awareness, and sometimes also the lack of enablers at local level, when we would like to do and to address the mitigation goals. And I guess that could be of inspiration for many of us that are working on the ground, to look at the experience that the CTCN is doing all over in the world. So thank you. Now it's time to invite all participants that would like to make a question to write it in the chat. But in the meanwhile, we start with the second part of our session, where we have two discussants. We have Mr. Bruno Dorin from the International Research Center of Agronomy and Development, and Mistress Saigusa Nobuko, that I invite to open the video. Good morning to all of you. And they will provide a 5 minutes intervention speech with opening our mind with new issues that are related to agriculture and forestry, and making some questions to the main speakers. So I would like to leave the floor first, as according to the program, to Mr. Bruno Doring, that got a PhD in economics and a postgraduate in agricultural engineering. She works for many years in France and in India, and works mainly on large issues like nexus, agriculture, nutrition, and much more. So please, Bruno, 5 minutes for you. Thank you.
Good morning, good evening, dear colleagues and friends. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, perfectly,
Yes.
perfectly.
Thank you. To feed our discussion on how agriculture and forestry sector could reduce greenhouse gases emission, as well as increase CO2 storage in soil and vegetation, I will try now to make visible some things that you hardly find today in global thinking and modeling. It is mostly based on a collective foresight study that I am completing with my Indian colleague. Next slide. I never know how it works. Yes. But let us start with France and a paper published a few days ago. In this paper, the author points out that French agriculture carbon sink potential is 5 times higher than what is anticipated by the government through key practices such as agroforestry, hedges, cover crops, and grassland in crop sequences. These practices foreshadows agroecological system. In India, agroecology is developing in a much more complex and integrated way, especially in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and I am convinced that the potential for carbon sink is much higher than in France. Also, I'm totally unable to give you any estimates. Andhra Pradesh is a state in South India with a population of 53 million in 2020, including about 10 million active farmers. Since 2016, Andhra Pradesh has been experimenting something that now looks like the world's largest agroecological transition. This experimentation is documented in the paper mentioned on the slide. It was a response to the dead hand of intensive industrial agriculture that had developed since the Green Revolution in the 60s. In this Lewis trap, as I call it, we have growing over-indebtedness and suicides of petty farmers within a fast-growing economy that do not create enough jobs in other sectors, especially for women and high-educated people, plus unbalanced and unhealthy foods that led India to rank behind Sudan in the Global Hunger Index, plus a massive and worrying erosion of natural resources on all fronts, plus, of course, growing climate change, which is deepening by the massive emission of greenhouse gas from Indian crops, livestock, and their industrial input, including subsidized fossil energy for irrigation and chemical fertilizer. In response to this deep socio-economic and environmental crisis, the government of Andhra Pradesh ambitioned in 2016 to help converting its farmers to what is called natural farming. This true form agroecology doesn't rely on fertilizer, pesticide, and irrigation, but on the combination of many plant and animal species that feed the soil food web and let the microbe work and the plant grows 365 days a year. Today, about 1 million micro farmers of Andhra Pradesh are practicing natural farming, and the ambition of the program is to convert all of them before 2030. This natural farming is a complete paradigm shift from the current global regime of industrial food and agriculture, which has two main characteristics. One, the specialization in a few standardized mass production to enable their robotization and generate economy of scale, the profit driver of any industrial activity. Two, the use of input produced by conventional science and industry to increase land productivity, provided you had and pay for genetic material, chemical fertilizer, pesticides, machinery, and now artificial intelligence. This paradigm of modern economic growth leads to what Peter Timmer called a world without agriculture, a world where agriculture represents less than 3% of employment and 3% of GDP, as in OECD today. In agroecology, on the contrary, land and labor productivity are based on a mosaic of local agroecosystems that each in their own way stimulates and optimizes biological synergy amongst many plant and animal species above and below the ground, the soil, from soil fungi to cereal, pulses and trees, from bacteria or earthworms to large bovids. The big problem with this potential multitude of unique and complex agroecosystems is that they are very difficult to model, unlike industrial agriculture with few commodities and simple input-output relationships. And when we don't model agroecology, we have no future scenario of agroecology, so no future other than industrial food and agriculture. This should question our community of economists, agronomists, and modelers, since first observation and evidence shows that agroecology, such as practice in Andhra Pradesh, thinks much more carbon than the few monocrop of the green evolution, is highly productive in useful biomass per surface unit, is highly resilient to economic, climate, and biotic shocks, is more profitable for macro farmer primarily through input saving, is more labor intensive than input and capital intensive, and is also highly productive in many environmental goods and services such as drinking water, biodiversity reservoirs, soil fertility, nutrient recycling, pollination, and just beautiful landscape. To bypass this absence of agroecological scenario in India and elsewhere, the government of Andhra Pradesh, the CIRAD and the FAO settled in 2019 a foresight platform with 3 components: a think tank gathering various expertise and knowledge from academics to farmers' representatives, who discussed and debated assumptions for 2 contrasting scenarios in 2050, one 100% industrial agriculture and the other 100% natural farming, with the support of the quantitative tool that I built for such collective exercise. Agribiome was designed as a flexible, simple, comprehensive, and transparent numeric tool, including an Indian Levisian submodel focusing on employment, productivities, and inequality, the 3 biggest challenges of an economy like the Indian one. I have no time to explain you in detail this slide of provisional output, which is just there to show that with agroecology, we could employ almost 100% of the 2064 years group in 2050, and that the cost to reduce income inequality and to boost the GDP would be far higher in the industrial scenarios than in the agroecological scenario. To conclude, this collective foresight exercise has shown that there is an alternative to industrial agriculture and food through agroecology, and that today's society has now invited to choose between 2 contrasting paths, since each promotes very different values about wealth, happiness, society, and nature. The first path is to continue to massively produce a few products that are processed, assembled, and differentiated downstream, where market value, investments, and jobs are increasingly concentrated, particularly to resolve the social and environmental flows in the system, such as rising costs of healthcare, water depletion and pollution, soil and biodiversity erosion, and of course, climate change. The second path is to produce in symbiosis in and with nature, with market values, investments, and job concentrated upstream to provide a diversity of quality product, as well as much sought after, but currently unpaid environmental services to small agroecological farmers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bruno, for providing us your view about the role of agroecology as an alternative in a specific context like India. Thank you. And now I will leave the floor to Mistress Nobuko Saigusa, that is Director of the Earth System Division of National Institute for Environmental Studies. She has engaged in long-term observation networks on the exchange of carbon dioxide between terrestrial ecosystems and the atmosphere. And she's also lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you for your nice introduction. Already great presentations have already been provided by previous speakers. I just would like to emphasize 2 points. One is we have to maximize the co-benefits of climate action, food production, and biodiversity conservation, because we have to enhance anthropogenic sinks, which is urgently needed. However, large-scale plantations and increased production of biofuel crops will cause severe conflicts with food production and biodiversity conservation over limited land and water. So this is the first point. And the second point is we have to pay attention to changes in natural greenhouse gas sinks and sources on a global scale, not only anthropogenic sinks and sources. Here, natural sinks may include such components which are difficult to separate between natural and anthropogenic components, such as forest fires and CO2 emissions from land soils. To go more in detail, let's think about carbon neutrality on a global scale. Carbon neutrality, in addition, in definition, in Paris Agreement, is achieving a balance between anthropogenic emissions and anthropogenic removal by sinks. In the left-hand side, in the yellow circle, we have to reduce anthropogenic emissions and balance with enhanced anthropogenic sinks. Here, we may have some issues. For example, even if energy decarbonization were to be well taken, emission reduction from food production and so on are limited. So we have to enhance anthropogenic sinks, but they may compete with biodiversity conservation and food security over land and water. This is my first point. And second point is natural emissions may increase due to future climate change. For example, forest fires due to drought and heat waves, or increased greenhouse gas emissions due to thawing of frozen soil, and so on. So, to confirm if the climate is really moving toward stability, we need to monitor both anthropogenic and natural sink and sources on a global scale. So this is a very large scale point, but we have to think about it. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's all my comments.
Thank you, Nobuko, for your insights about the global view and how much is important to, I mean, maybe it's the line of our session. We are going from the ground, so what we can do on the ground in a specific site, and what we have to look at when we have a global view of the relevant issues that are connected to the mitigation goals. So we have 5 minutes more, and I invite the two main speakers, Mr. Tubiello and Mrs. Carina, according to what the suggestion that came from Bruno Dorin and from Nobuko Saigusa, to add some comments and to try to reply at the idea they showed us. Thank you.
Should I start or?
Yes.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you to the two discussants. I think they made very good point, very important point. I mean, from one perspective, if you think about my presentation, I left it at sort of describing what's going on in terms of what's on the ground today. But of course, there are so many when it comes to food and food cultures, so many important and related ecosystem stewardship, so many important points that have been raised that I just like to reflect on them a little bit more. So in terms of the comments or the positions made by Professor Doran, I suppose. Yeah, no, I mean, I enjoyed the comments you made. Maybe just to complement and reinforce what you said. I mean, if you look at the picture that I showed, in terms of what food systems emissions look like, in particular, this explosion of emissions from the supply chain, right? There's no doubt that it's basically all linked to the production system, or if you will, more the economic model that is behind it, that generates impacts beyond. Well, it's very difficult to find a good word here, but maybe beyond what they should be, right? And if you think of the I was mentioning the verticalization of food, but when I saw the first results of our own statistics, it became very clear, just even reflecting on the experience of some of us who've seen, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm that old to have seen the rise of the supermarket, but there's been an explosion in vertically integrated food distribution that brings with it huge problems, right, that then reflect all the way. So if you think about the impact, for example, of refrigeration, right, in supermarkets, and the F-gases emissions, which are actually now driving retail emissions and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to complement the picture that you have brought up, which certainly has to do with industrial agricultural production, which is an issue in its own right, also with a reflection on what that is attached to, which is the distribution system. That I guess some of the things you have discussed would help address, on both sides, right?
Please, Francesco, if you can be shorter, because I would like to leave before to close.
Yeah, no,
the
of
floor
course.
also
Sorry.
to Karina. Sorry, eh?
Yeah, no.
Sorry,
actually,
because we have a couple of minutes, no more.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll stop here. Sorry, Karina. Back to
Thank you. Sorry. Karina, would you like to add some comments related to the two different discussions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to say, the presentation that you made, Bruno, I think provides a really compelling case for making these kinds of changes, and this is the very type of information and examples I think that are so useful to share in a broader context, because we know that there are so many methods and technologies that already exist that could be used, and if they were just if there was more awareness about them and support to help access these types of methods and thinking, then we could really make much stronger progress. It's not that we have to develop a million new things to move forward. So I mean, it's really interesting, and I would love to read more about this work. And then for Nabucco, I think you made very salient points about these challenges in reaching kind of a balance. And also with the sensitive issue of biodiversity. And I think these are some of the issues that countries need to increasingly be considering as they're focusing on these national goals regarding climate change, because you can take some steps, but you have to be thinking about the larger picture of, with increased climate change, are increasing challenges because of these issues of forest fire and others. So thank you both for those very helpful cases.
Thank you, Karina. To be so short, we have just 1 minute and one question from the participants that I would like to share with you. Thank you very much for sharing your projects. I would like to know more about your approach to gender mainstreaming in CTCN projects, as it addresses the co-benefits aspect of climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. Just 1 minute and short, because, sorry, we have to leave the floor to the next session.
Yeah, of course. So the CTCN has a gender policy and action plan that we incorporate across all of our areas of work. And for each technical assistance, a specific amount of the budget has to be focused on gender mainstreaming. This can be to hire some gender specialists if the expertise is not available in the network partner, but also to look at things like gender budgeting, stakeholder analysis, and so forth. And of course, there are very particular issues that need to be considered depending on the particular sector, whether it's transport or agriculture. And so these are things that we try to also help advise our implementers as they're working through. And then, of course, in our monitoring and evaluation, we have gender-specific, gender-aggregated indicators that we also report on, and have been actually doing a review recently of how this is working in terms of our technical assistance so that we can continue to improve the process of gender mainstreaming in our work.
Thank you. There is no more time, so I have to thanks to all the panelists for participate. And please take care, because in the next session we will go on with this argument, because the next session is related to energy and food security. So we are still in our field of interest. So thank you all the participants and to the panelists. Bye.
Okay, welcome back to the session 2 of the 13th LCS RNet annual meeting. My name is Toshihiko Masui, National Institute for Environmental Studies. So this session, the title is Energy and Food Securities, Challenges and Barriers to a Decarbonized Society. So in the previous session, session 1, we could have a very good discussion about the apple sectors. And in addition to the apple sectors, the energy is also quite important to achieve the decarbonized society. And both the agriculture products and energies are the global commodities. And so we are combining through the very complex the supply chain in the world. But we are now facing the many risks, especially COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that we will have to solve both these social issues and to reduce or to decarbonize the emission. So in this session, we would like to discuss the decarbonized issues from the viewpoint of the international security, mainly focused on energy and food. So we would like to invite 2 speakers from energy field and the agriculture field. Firstly, we would like to invite Mike Bradshaw from the UK ERC Energy Research Center and Warwick Business School on energies. So he's an expert of the energy. So I hope, he will show some the insight of the energies toward the decarbonized society. Okay, so Mike, right?
Hello. Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, maybe even good night. Let me just share my screen and we can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll go to full screen mode. Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's actually not the first time I've spoken to the network. I did speak back in 2017 when the meeting was held in Warwick. And actually, that's 5 years ago, isn't it? So I was talking about similar issues, but of course, the world has moved on and not necessarily in a most constructive fashion. So yes, I'm a professor in the business school at Warwick, a professor of global energy. but I'm also a co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre. And what I'm going to speak to you today about is research which is funded in part by UKIRC, in large part, I should say. And within UKIRC, I lead a theme which is called UK Energy in a global context. And in that research program, we have a project which is called the Geopolitics of Energy System Transformation. And that's what I want to talk about, the relationship between geopolitical factors and the transformation of the global energy system to achieve rapid decarbonisation to mitigate climate change. We're also working in this theme with the energy modelers at UCL. And I think one of the important issues which we're working on at the moment, in fact, we were discussing last week, is the relationship between geopolitics and the models that are constructed to show pathways to net zero. And perhaps that's an issue we can pick up in the discussion and questions. So in my own work, I'm particularly interested in the interrelationship between energy, environment, and economy, and what I call the global energy dilemma. Can the world have secure, affordable, and equitable energy services, which is a definition of energy security, that are environmentally benign? And of course, climate change is one of the most challenging problems, but it's not the only problem that's environmental problem created by the energy system. And of course, the transformation of the energy system also changes the nature of the environmental impacts. And for example, trade-offs between energy security and food security over the production of biofuels would be an example. So I'm interested in this relationship between energy security, geopolitics on the one hand, climate change, now net zero will be the term we might use, in the context of economic globalization, an increasingly globalized world until recently, in the context now of discussions around the more fragmented and deglobalizing world. So what I'm interested in is, what does all of this mean for energy system transformation and climate mitigation? I just want to very quickly define some key terms here, because energy security is one of those terms used by many, but are often confused. An academic survey identified over 60 different definitions of energy security. I want to go with a simple definition from the IEA that identifies energy security as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. Particularly in a European context, but also globally today, that issue of affordable price is particularly challenging. So we can see energy security as being a long-term issue, which deals with making the necessary investments to supply energy in line with the economic development and environmental needs, but also a short-term issue focusing on the availability of the ability of the energy system to deliver short-term or address short-term interruptions to supply. And we're very much facing a significant short-term energy security crisis at the moment. Although originating in Europe, it has global implications. Another way of thinking about energy security is in terms of these three dimensions that I put up here. Physical security, getting enough energy that we need to meet our needs. Price security, getting that energy at a price that we can afford. And thirdly, geopolitical security, ensuring that the state retains independence in its foreign policy through avoiding dependence on particular nations. And when we talk about geopolitics, again, another term constantly used but seldom defined. I'm actually a geographer by training. I have a background in political geography, from whence geopolitics originates. But geopolitics has three qualities. It's about the influence and power over space and territory. It uses geographical frames, like sphere of influence, near, abroad. And it's also future oriented. So often we're looking at how geopolitics is impacting on future developments, particularly in scenario planning. So I would define the geopolitics of energy security as the influence of geographical factors, such as the distribution of centers of supply and demand on state and non-state actions to ensure adequate, affordable, and reliable supplies of energy. And of course, we also, in the context of climate change and environmental challenges, that has to be sustainable. This is an issue that has attracted attention in recent years. Most significantly, back in 2019, the IRENA report on the geopolitics of energy transformation observed that the energy transformation will alter the global distribution of power relations between states, the risks of conflict, and the social, economic, and environmental drivers of political instability. Most recently, the IEA, preparing a report for a G20 meeting this summer, noted that energy security is evolving. The types of risks to energy supplies are broadening. The accelerated transitions are likely to amplify both old and new security factors, requiring the bolstering of resilience and emergency response capacities to ensure the uninterrupted flow of affordable energy. Energy transition or transformation itself is a geopolitical process. Now, we've had presentations this morning talking about the IPCC and what we need to achieve to ensure rapid decarbonisation. This simply sort of summarizes 2 points of view, really, when it comes to the transition, a rapid transition. We have peak fossil fuel demand in the coming years, certainly by the end of this decade, rapid fall in fossil fuel consumption, a rapid buildup of non-fossil energy sources. But that, to achieve the climate change, that buildup of non-fossil sources has to be extremely rapid. Now, a simple review of a host of scenarios would tell you that there tends to be two scenarios now, with a third increasingly apparent. One is a gradual transition, and this is not achieving the targets, where there's a huge amount of inertia in the system, and the pace of change is incompatible with the Paris Agreement. And secondly is the normative view, if you like, the rapid transition, where we see the rapid deployment of new clean energy technologies, new markets, new policies, new business models, and we achieve net zero. But increasingly, we're having to confront the fact that what we seem to have is a messy transition or a disorderly transition that fails to manage the phase out of fossil fuel consumption alongside the buildup of clean power generation. We have increased price volatility, a public backlash against the transition, and a breakdown in international cooperation. And unfortunately, this seems to be the world which we're inhabiting at the moment. And the problem is, achieving climate mitigation requires that we be in the world of a rapid transition. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the detail here because of time constraints, but just simply to say that we conceive of this process of transformation as being two transitions. The high transition, which is about the phasing out of fossil fuels, which poses a whole set of challenges to fossil fuel producer economies, which have wider geopolitical implications and geoeconomic implications. And at the same time, a set of geopolitical challenges that come along with the low carbon transition built around rapid electrification. And we're already talking about these issues around critical materials, control over clean tech supply chains, and looking forward to a potential international trade in hydrogen as an example. Interestingly, and I'm not going to go through these, I'm flagging this up for you to think about because you can access this online. The International Energy Agency, in its World Energy Outlook last month, asked the question, how do we avoid a messy transition? Recognizing that a messy transition is highly unlikely to achieve the rate of decarbonisation and mitigation, and certainly will impact on the deployment of low carbon technologies. And they've come up with a suggestion of a set of issues that address many of the issues that were on the previous slide that we need to think about, and perhaps will also be discussed in our conference over the next couple of days. And issues that we need to look at to ensure that we have the necessary pace of transition and we avoid a messy outcome. I just want to finish by illustrating some of these challenges. This is taken from a piece in the Financial Times last year, which is really very interesting, and I'm happy to share the slides and links afterwards. And the map is showing the capacity to generate solar power, and overlaid on it are the oil and gas reserves. And the simple observation is that the geography of the two are quite different. That actually what we are likely to see eventually in the deployment of a low carbon energy system is a new geography of energy production. If we look at this in the specific context of hydrogen, this is taken from the IEA report on the future of hydrogen, and it's looking at that map in terms of the costs of producing hydrogen from the hybrid solar PV and onshore wind. Again, you can see that we've got this clear geography, this north-south geography. Now, if you go back to the previous slide and look at who's installing the solar power, it's not the places where the sun shines. It's places where there is policy support, there is money, and there is low level of investor country risk. The challenge then is to get to a situation where we're building out the solar and the wind in the areas where it's most effective to do that, not only addressing local energy access issues, but also creating the potential for trade in international hydrogen. This comes from a study by KPMG, the accountants, and it's looking at a future potential international trade in hydrogen. And it's talking about areas which have got the potential to be exporters, but the potential to be producers of technology and exporters of technology, and also importers. Now, hydrogen is big in Japan, is big in Europe, but both places are seen as being the centers of a hydrogen economy that will rely on imports of hydrogen and its derivatives, such as ammonia and methanol. IRENA most recently has turned its lens to look at the geopolitics of international hydrogen trade. And this map actually is based on a review of all of the hydrogen strategies. Over 30 countries now have hydrogen strategies, and what they are talking about in terms of bilateral agreements and potential patterns of trade. And again, it highlights the idea of these two nodes with a global system of supply, not unlike today's liquefied natural gas industry, where Japan was a major player in developing the global economy, where these would actually develop out of bilateral agreements and eventually end up creating a global network of supply. So the whole idea here is that you're going to create this global hydrogen economy to supply low carbon energy to existing centers of demand. This raises a whole set of geopolitical challenges around control over the trade flows, the production, the investment flows, and so on and so forth. So this is not unlike a fossil fuel system. But I'll leave you with one final thing to consider. This is developing an international network to move hydrogen and its derivatives to existing locations of industry to decarbonize those industries. Why would you do that? Why would you not simply move the industry to where the future sources of low carbon energy are? And this, again, is a sort of a geo-economic challenge with geopolitical implications. It's a discussion certainly underway in Europe today in the context of the energy crisis. Will the focus on energy and carbon promote another round of deindustrialization in Europe as industry moves to future low carbon and low cost industrial locations? So the point I'm making is really quite simple. Current crisis has put us into the world of a messy transition. And there's a set of questions that we need to think about in terms of our ability to deliver the host of low carbon solutions that you were talking about in your own work. We need to consider the impact of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine on the pace of the energy transition. Will it hinder or will it accelerate the pace of transition? Can we use this as a chance with the current emphasis on energy and security to accelerate climate action? And that's very much Europe's intention with Repower EU. What are the impacts of the global crisis on emerging and developing economies and their ability to afford low carbon solutions and provide low carbon energy solutions to their population? What are the consequences of an increasingly fragmented and decoupled world for economic growth? No, economic growth and prosperity is necessary to fund the deployment of low carbon energy technologies. In short, is there a way out of the current messy transition? And I'll leave you with that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you. It's quite the good review on the energy security issues. Yeah, and you have some questions. So please check the Q&A box. Later on, please reply to those questions. Yeah, if you have time. And yeah, so after the reply to the discussant's question. Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you. Okay, so we'd like to move to the second speaker, Professor Rizaldi Boer, Bogor Agriculture University in Indonesia. Professor Rizaldi, praise you.
Thank you very much, Masushi Sensei. So now I would like to also to share a bit, especially on this aspect of food security under the decarbonized society. So probably I'm just we'll talk about some of the challenges that we are facing in terms of food security in the decarbonized society. So I bring an example for case of Indonesia, even though we might also look at the global view. So as we all know, actually, the agriculture is face a big challenge, I think, to meet the increasing demand for food and also to end hunger. While also the agriculture facing risk of climate change, also demand for reducing the emission. As we know, that actually the emission from the agriculture sector is tend to increase from time to time. And without any significant intervention, we know that actually the contribution of this sector are going to go up to more than 30% of the total emission. But so of course, in decarbonize this sector, I think agriculture need to use less land. Especially if the world is reverse deforestation and halt the global collapse of biodiversity. I think we need to increase the land use efficiency. And of course, to increase the land use efficiency, I think also we need to have a sustainable supply of water, and irrigation infrastructures need to be developed. So also we can increase the cropping intensity. Also increasing the productivity, also another challenge that warming atmosphere bring more extreme weather event, as we all know, change the length of season, heat stress, also the emergence of crop pests and diseases. And also, of course, also how to reduce also food loss is also a matter of technology that's not applied by many of farmers in developing countries. There is still a big percentage of food loss, especially during the harvesting time, because of the technology and also the behavior of the people. When the economy is developed, I think tend to increase the food waste. And on the other hand, we know also the current farming practices I already mentioned is also contribute to the greenhouse gas emission. And also this is also another challenge, how actually we can really increase the adoption of low carbon farming by the communities and by any other stakeholders. But if we look at the global situation that need to reach the Paris target, I think where actually the plan actually we need to reach net zero emission by 2050. And hopefully before the 2050, if you would like to stabilize the increase of a global temperature below 1.5 degrees. In this case, I think we need to reach net deforestation by 2030. And this actual target, I think, is also a big challenge, especially in many of the developing countries. Is also deforestation still happening. And also, we also need to target it to increase the land rehabilitation by 2050 up to 191 million hectares. Including also the enhance and expanding the protected areas for the biodiversity, which is minimum of 57%. Also, where possible, emission from land use sector or should be a negative emission already, not later by 2050. Of course, the international cooperation are crucial on this case. And I think RDDD, like result-based payment, is one of the programs that might also provide an incentive, positive incentive for the country, developing country or forestry developing country who can reduce also the deforestation. Now, of course, achieving this goal requires joint effort and educate international support through the cooperative with countries with large things potential. Yeah. Implementation of standard related to the international trade rules for agricultural communities that are carbon intensive and changed in international consumption pattern toward environmentally friendly agricultural product. And I think we know that in the case of Indonesia, it is also pressure on us as because more than 50% of the targeting exporting country of agricultural products will also have net zero emission by 2050. It means that actually we have to ensure that actually the agricultural products from Indonesia also have a low carbon footprint. And I think this is one of the global enabler that also need to be in place, I think, to make this transition. And also sorry. Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Something wrong with my system.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, slightly changed. Oh.
Sorry.
No problem.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I can see your slide.
Okay. Oh my God. Oh. Very sorry, very sorry.
No, no.
So we know also for the another situation that need to be reached at a global level, especially an adoption and efficient rational farming. So productivity should be increased by 50%. It's also quite high. Also, the minimum post-harvest, high water use efficiency, as I mentioned, the use of the nitrogen to go down into 50%. But at the same time, we also need to increase the agriculture productivities. And I think many of the current situation now, actually, farmers in the developing countries still use less of nitrogen, but it's continued to increase, and also the need to introduce the organic farming type, and also the food security related to the healthy situation. By 2050, also need to reach the zero hunger, healthy food, and minimum food waste. While for demand for beef, also because of change of the diet, hopefully the actual demand for beef might also reduce because of the environmental issues. And in the context of Indonesia, so we develop kind of scenarios. It's already submitted by the government of Indonesia, how actually the sector are going to reach the net sink before 2030. This is also another big challenge. But of course, actually the burden is put more on the land use chain and forestry, where actually the sector now actually to be as an emitter. And now by 2030 is good to be converted to the net sink. And the situation that need to be reached during that time, especially we need to increase the use of unproductive land. So in this context, the agricultural expansion, which is by current estimate, we have about 54.3 million hectares by 2010. So we only need to have increased by 10 million hectares by 2050 in order to ensure that food security is still there. And also avoiding conversion of cropland to non-crop land, which is particularly happen in many of in Java in particular. So we also need to stop that. And I saw the government also issues kind of this kind of regulation how actually we can stop the conversion of the productive agricultural land into non-agricultural land. I think it's also common happen in many areas, especially close to the urban area because of the land price. And then in the context of Indonesia, we also start also to support the farmer how to convert the farming system, especially in the peatland, to a polyculture system, because at current situation, or most of the farmers are familiar with the right type of farming system. And the peatland ecosystems, they need to drain them. So they also will expose the peat into high oxidation and also release a big amount of emission. So in the strategy, we also targeted to reach by 4 million hectares by 2050, because now of the 12 million hectares of peatland, so about half of it is already open. And so half of that open peat is also now being degraded. This is actually being targeted for how to restore that. And also increasing food crop productivity, especially on the palm oil, because the palm oil who use a large land in the context of expansion of agriculture. So we also need to double the current productivity in order to avoid the expansion of the or to increasing the target of palm oil by increasing or by expanding the land. Increasing cropping intensity, cereal, for example, the crop also by 2 to 5 food waste, especially how actually we can reduce also the food loss by increasing the technology in harvesting, which is from 29 to 10% and by 2050, and also minimize the food waste because by under the business as usual, actually by increasing the GDP, normally the food waste increasing. So we are trying to limit that up to 396 kilogram per capita per year by 2050. So there is not much increasing. So it seems we need to minimize the food waste. Well, of course, the challenge in using the unproductive land and increasing crop productivity is because low fertility of unproductive land. So we need to have research and also technology innovation for that. And also low productivity, there is a big gap at this stage, and also increasing crop productivity and also increasing the intensity because of frequent extreme climate event. So I see it also another challenge because of the frequent harvesting failure because of this event. So Indonesia, for example, average production loss due to the harvest failure because of the extreme event in 5 years is equivalent to about 20% and 30%. So in this case, actually, if we look at the study made by Ross Grant from IFRI, it is quite big the gap, the investment gap for research and innovation, especially and also on the adoption of climate smart agriculture practice in the global south. So the investment gap in this research and for the research and innovation for sustainable agriculture and also intensification, it is estimated about $4 billion per year. And also another 6.5 billion per year is also need for invested in technical climate smart agriculture in order to reduce the emission, which is from this sector, which is in line with the Paris project. So it is estimated the innovation investment gap to reduce the hunger by 5% globally, and also reduce the greenhouse gas emission to a level consistent with Paris pathway will require about 10.5 billion annually. But on the same time, also we also consider that advancement of climate technology, I think it also need to be seen as one of the benefit of this technology, how actually the farmers can also make use of this technology to reduce the crop failure due to the extreme climate event and also increasing the productivity. So in this case, in the government release have responded into this kind of the need, and also some of the activity has been underway, especially introducing and develop capacity of the farmers how to adopt the climate forecast information, and also tailor the cropping system into the forecast in order to reduce the risk of extreme event. So at present, the farmer field school, which is introduced by the Ministry of Agriculture, not in collaboration with the Met Bureau, Meteorological Office, which is started from 2011, and up to now, actually, there are 548 locations that has been implemented the climate field school, which also involve about 18,000 participant farmers. So the evaluation has been done, and actually quite interesting actually when the farmers that use the climate forecast and tailor crop management into the forecast actually can increase the productivity up to 30%. And this actually now being continued to be expanded. And of course, we also the government also the self kind of information system that linking the climate information with crop management. So we call it CATAM or crop calendar, which allow the farmers to plan for input purchases and use, determine the labor requirement, seed need, and also other aspects of farm management, including also the forecast for the pest and disease. But the main problem actually is the lack of the facility for both farmers and agri extension workers to always be connected to the internet, because it's one actually introducing the climate information for the farmers. And in addition, also the farmer agriculture extension worker are also at least required to have a smartphone, so they don't have in many cases. But I think for the long term, this should be not a problem, but need to be targeted also how we can address this kind of challenges. And climate insurance is also now is being piloting. So actually, how this kind of insurance system can also help the farmer to increase the willingness to adopt the climate adaptive technology, because by the climate insurance, we also have to benefit by adopting the climate adaptive technologies. The crop might save and also survive from the extreme event, but at the same time, because the insurance is covered for the climate index, so the farmer will get benefit, including from the claim, from the payment, from the insurance, including also for the crop. And then changing farming practices in the peatland ecosystem is also one of the big programs that Indonesia is now doing in order to decarbonize the agriculture sector. So supporting farmers, especially in converting the farming practices in peatland into polyculture, so the rewetting, revegetation, and revitalization. And then we have done kind of interview with many of the some farmers. So many of them actually are aware and have increased their understanding on the need to restore the peatland, because they also face a frequent failure because of the fire of the pit, because the drain pit are very prone into fire. So they also give up with that, and so that's why they would like to also to try to adopt this kind of farming system. We call it polyculture. Then, of course, another challenge for that actually there's no access to credit for peat farming at present. So now we also do some of study and also how actually different scheme can be created and for support of farmer, especially operate in the peat ecosystem. And another channel also market for the restored peat is also not big yet. And crop management technology in peatland is also still need to be developed. And I think this is part of the need for the investment, and which also create gap of investment for the technology on this. And now the challenge for increasing cropping intensity. And this is also another challenge because the increasing cropping intensity also need water, because we, especially on the dry season, it's very hard to increase the cropping intensity without water. So the presence of irrigation infrastructure is also needed. But the situation is many of the water set are also being degraded. The number of critical water set, for example, increased from year to year. So now I think the government are applying a new regulation, which also mandated for all government to set up their spatial plan following the principle of carrying capacity. So it means that actually, based on that, actually there are areas that need to the direction of utilization could be for production, which is also okay for agricultural activities. Also direction used for protection and also for rehabilitation. Rehabilitation means actually the role of this area in providing the environmental service and calling the supplying water is very crucial. So this also need to be rehabilitated. So through introduction of social forestry and also support and facilitating farmers to convert the current farming practices mostly monoculture system into an agroforestry system also still underway. And this also being linking to with incentive system. So there is Indonesia now also start about the Indonesia Economic Instrument, which also provide kind of support and fiscal policy for the local government who actually really have a performance in terms of restoring their ecosystem. And also linking with the carbon pricing policy, it is also now one of the policies that government have issued. And of course, this also might create kind of opportunity for the small farmers who would also adopt kind of low carbon farming practices, and they might get kind of income from the carbon certificates or carbon emission reduction that can be converted into a carbon credit. So now the instrument, the regulation on that is already just signed about 2 months ago. Is also one of the interesting innovation of the policy that government Indonesia has put in. And of course, result-based payment is also another critical international program that need to be revisited, especially and putting up incentive for REDD, because we know that actually the market of incentives being provided is relatively low. Especially, for example, now it's only just so we have received already the result-based payment for REDD, which equivalent to about $5 per ton of CO2. But we know that actually protecting the forest, avoiding deforestation, is to create a global benefit, not only from the carbon perspective, but also from biodiversity and also environmental services. And I think we also need to see how actually we can internalize the value of the environmental services, including biodiversity, into a carbon price. So I think by having this kind, actually, the incentives being received by the developing countries can also reinvest to support the implementation of low carbon farming practices, including also the development of the infrastructure and research. So this actually just to give some of the research that we have done. Actually, this kind of research need to be done by all the local government when they set up and develop their revise their spatial plan. So we can see here very clearly how actually the water flow happening from the where actually the direction of water flows come from the protection areas, and we can see some of the protection areas is actually need to be rehabilitated. Since this also related into the process of how to convert the monoculture farming practices into agroforestry system. So there's a social forestry now is so underway also, and I think this is also one of the important programs that need to be supported also by the international. I think this has been mentioned also by previous speaker. I think about the agroforestry system. And this only just one of the illustration just to show you how actually the impact the implementation of by decarbonizing the land use channel and forestry actually have positive impact on the carrying capacity, and especially on supplying water. So I think because the water at the time is very limited, so I just end up to this, and I think it's welcome to have this further discussion on this. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rizaldi. I'm sorry to hurry you up. Thank you for introduction of the situation of Indonesia. So the food crop intensity and productivity improvement might be important to solve the food security issues. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the speakers. So at the first part, the energy issues and food issues, were explained independently. But to achieve the decarbonized society, we will have to consider both issues from the global perspectives and the local perspectives. So at the second part, we'd like to how to combine these issues and how to solve. We explore the solution considering these two issues, and maybe we will have to consider the other issues. But before the discussion, we'd like to invite three panelists. So first panelist is the Rob Gross. He's the director of the UK Research Centre. So Rob.
Good morning and good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will keep my remarks quite brief in the interests of time, and I will respond principally to some of the points that Professor Bradshaw was making, and in particular the idea of the politics of a messy transition and how we guard against that if we possibly can. The first observation that I would make in this regard is that the level of investment that we are going to continue to need globally, in particular in renewables, but also other sources of low carbon electricity, is extremely significant and should not be underestimated. There is some danger, I think, that because we've seen quite rapid progress with the deployment of wind and solar in many countries around the world, and we've seen their costs come down so dramatically that they are quite cost competitive on the levelized cost basis, in fact cheaper now because of the very high gas prices we're experiencing, that we can relax about the deployment of low carbon electricity generation, that it's kind of easy, or that the market will take care of it. And whilst the international kind of companies around the world that install renewables have become extremely good and competent at their jobs, and the international financial community has become very comfortable with supporting these investments, that doesn't mean that the need for very active and concerted policy efforts to ensure that the returns to investment are secure and stable, revenue streams are stable, and so on, doesn't mean that those kinds of issues have gone away. And in some respects, I think that's where we could find the solution to the messy transition. We can't, the messy transition in terms of international politics, what might be happening in Russia, for example, is something that's almost impossible to control for. But the politics in those countries, both developed and developing nations that have made strong commitments to tackling climate change, I think are more controllable. And if you look at the provisions that the US government has made through the Inflation Reduction Act, and just how much of that is focused on green energy and renewables and mobilizing investment, you can see how there's a direct connection between energy security, economic growth, and bringing jobs back into kind of the deindustrialized wealthy countries, and our decarbonisation goals. In fact, you could argue that the Inflation Reduction Act does that so well that it creates problems of international trade, because the incentives are so significant that companies will be relocating to the US, for example, from European markets. So that's one observation. The second observation I would make is that we should be cautious, in my view, about how mobile or otherwise, over what time frame various heavy energy users might be. Historically, yes, of course, large energy users co-located with sources of energy. So, for example, in the early 20th century, it was very common to find aluminium smelting in mountainous locations where they could access hydroelectricity. Whether that's still true now, and whether that's more realistic than moving hydrogen around, I think that's something that remains to be seen. My final observation is to try and make this link between food and energy, which is to say this, that in almost every conceivable realistic scenario looking forward, the inertia in the system of the energy system is such that we are in a world of overshoot and recovery in terms of global carbon emissions. That puts very strong emphasis on the interrelationships between energy supply and land use, the opportunities for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and other options to begin in the second half of this century to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in very large amounts. And so I believe that will be the biggest focus for research endeavour, and understanding those trade-offs between and opportunities to get very high quality ecosystem services from the land, to use the land for carbon removal and remediation, as well as meeting our food needs. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you for your very deep insight related to the linkage between food and energy. So I think there are many trade-offs and synergies between land and agriculture and energy. So yeah, we will have to focus on these issues. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'd like to move to second discussant, Professor Tomoko Hasegawa. She's an associate professor at Ritsumeikan University. Okay.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to input this meeting. And I have working on the climate change and food securities, so I would like to comment and from that perspective. And food and energy are separate issues, but once climate change mitigation is considered, they can compete. And afforestation and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage are major carbon removal technologies. And these technologies require land, and nitrogen, and water resources, so they can compete with food through these resources. And our recent research revealed that the ambitious climate change mitigation through large-scale bioenergy BECCS and afforestation will negatively affect food security. So as a measures to reduce such a risk, it is necessary to implement food policies along with climate change mitigation. And for example, as Professor Borsch shows, the increases in the crop yields are very important measures at the production side. And in order to that, for example, globalization of trade of food is also important, because global trade would reallocate the production place to more efficient way and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And also at the consumption side, changes in diet and the consumption patterns also important to reduce the greenhouse gases from the consumption side, especially for food. The changing in diet can reduce emissions from livestock. And moreover, and finally, our recent study shows that in order to achieve the same ambitious target, earlier climate action is better for food security compared to the delayed action. And if we delay climate action, we will need to cut greenhouse gas emission more rapidly in the end of this century. And this will require a large-scale implementation of bioenergy with carbon storage and captured, carbon captured and storage and afforestation. And that would cause a drastic change in land use and raising the concerns about raising food prices and increasing the risk of hunger. So yeah, in summary, I would like to say towards climate change mitigation while keeping the sustainable energy and food system, a single measure is not enough, and integrated measures is required. And after seeing your the two speakers' presentation, I have some questions to resolve the board. You said you said in Indonesia you are thinking to using the unproductive land for agriculture and increase the crop productivity. But I'm wondering if to do so, maybe you have to increase the nitrogen fertilizer or other resources. So, and that would affect other environment like nitrogen, increasing the nitrogen input. So how do you think such a balance between the food, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and food security and then other nitrogen impacts? That's all for now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hasegawa. Okay, so we'd like to move to last discussant, Dr. Marido Plato-Gasquet. She's a researcher of International Research Center on Agronomy and Development. So, Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is there a possibility to just show PowerPoint or not?
Oh yeah, please, if you have, please.
Okay. Well, anyway, I don't know how to do it, so I will start without. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So, as several people have talked about scenarios and the link between energy and food, how they linked, I would just like to talk very briefly about a foresight work that we did several years ago, which is called Agrément Terra, which was on land use and food security in 2050. In this foresight, we linked the general context of the economy and the global context, which was about governments, development, and energy. And we looked how it was linked to cropping system, livestock systems, farm structures, relationship between rural and urban linkages, and forestry, and had several scenarios. Contrary to the energy scenario, we got 5 scenarios. The first scenario, which we call land use driven by metropolization, was a scenario when the energy production and consumption was very high and using fossil fuel. That was kind of what was going on until a few years ago. In this scenario, energy didn't have much impact right now on land use and food security, but the scenario itself was not sustainable because very rapidly, in a few years, I mean, by 2050, there was really high climate change, and because there was no attention to use of energy coming from fossil fuels. Then we had the second scenario, which was called land use for regional food systems. There, energy production increased energy production from renewable energy and use of regionally available fossil fuels. The impacts really differed on each region. That if in the region where they had land constraint, there was solar and wind energy. When there was some land availability, there were biofuels production, dedicated crops. When there was more available cropland, biomass was more specifically produced for energy production. And when there was extensive forestry area, that it was used for energy. So it showed that the link between food and energy can be very different from one region to the other one. Our third scenario was called land use for multi-active and mobile household. And there was the creation of decentralized energy systems by bringing together residents, renewable energy producers, and various energy consumers via smart networks. That the impact on energy, on food, was through agricultural practices, but their agroecology and sustainable intensification was very largely used. Our fourth scenario was called land use for food quality and healthy nutrition. There was global energy consumption in farms, less energy consumption in farms and for food transformation. There was a large development of agroecology and agroforestry. However, because there's a need to consume less energy, a lot of the residues are used in the soil for carbon content and soil management practices. So what we saw is that when we had a scenario for food quality and healthy nutrition, there were potential tensions between food security, energy, and climate change mitigation. So it was not easy to have all food security and energy production at the same time because of this need for carbon sequestration. The last one was land as commons for rural communities in a fragmented world. There was less energy consumption because of crisis. Also development of agroecology and development of dedicated crops. My conclusion is the following, is that if we want to look at the linkages between energy and food production and security, we have to be very careful at what happens in diets, because diets have an impact on production, and there's energy used for food production and for food transformation. When diets are very modern with transformed products, it requires a lot of energy in production and transformation. The second point, which is important, is our farming practices. As my colleague said before, agroecology really requires less use of energy, low use of mineral nitrogen. It is developed in local food systems. It has an impact on carbon sequestration and biodiversity, on diversity of crops and therefore on food diets, and on use of residues. Agroforestry is definitely a practice that should be developed in order to improve both food security and energy production. Of course, knowledge and technologies are very important, and they would improve the relationship. One thing that we haven't talked very much about is the use of water. There's often competition in the use of water in agriculture and the use of water for energy production, because we shouldn't forget hydraulic energy production. And about wind and solar energy, it was also important to look, as was shown before, where they are set up and on what kind of soil they are set up. So I thank you very much for the time you've given me, and I hope these comments do help for the debate.
Thank you very much, Marie. Yeah, so your scenarios and insights are quite informative and yeah, quite helpful to the discussion. But sorry, the time has already 9 o'clock in Japan. So yeah, I'd like to invite again the speakers to respond or to make another comments or opinion yeah, on these issues, food and energy issues. So firstly, Mike, would you please?
Okay, thank you very much. Just two very quick comments. I mean, one in response to Rob's observations about the IRA, I would see this as actually a symptom of a messy transition. It's really it's driving regionalization, fragmentation. It's about building US-centric supply chains, and it's actually in direct competition to China. And actually, if you look at, I mean, there's a debate raging at the moment about the costs of deglobalization. If we end up in a more fragmented, regionally based, even bipolar world with China and US competing, the conventional wisdom is that will make the costs of decarbonisation higher, not lower. It's a suboptimal solution from an economist's perspective. As someone who studies geopolitics, I'd say, well, probably that's the reality we're going to have to live with. Can we actually turn that complicated situation into a more competitive approach to decarbonisation that does actually realise that we're in a race against time? Just one comment more generally about the intent of my presentation. I think I've listened to the presentations, the really detailed, excellent work that's going on. It's an invitation to actually think about the world we live in and how that impacts on the work that you do and the prospects for actually getting policies, funding implemented in the world that we are currently confronting. Because I think there's a huge disconnect here between what scientists are talking about is necessary and what social scientists like myself are saying is the geopolitical reality that governments and policymakers and companies and financiers are living in. It's all very well to create paper solutions and paper transitions, but the emphasis really is on rapid implementation that requires substantial finance. Just final comment before I forget, the issue of industries moving. Industries don't move. Industries close and new industries open. And what will happen is that the industry in Europe will close and new industries will open. And it's already happening. Look at what's being proposed in the Gulf economies in terms of their circular carbon economies. That's what will happen. We'll lose industry in some places and new industry will develop elsewhere. But my intent has been to ask you to actually think about the geopolitical consequences. The cost of nitrogen fertilizer is a direct consequence of the conflict in Ukraine, and that has a direct impact on food security.
Thank you very much. Okay. So, Professor Rizaldi.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to also respond to a comment that has been raised by Tomoko. Of course, the use of the unproductive land will have because we also need to apply fertilizer, but there are a number of ways how actually we can reduce the use of nitrogen fertilizers. Principally, you can use also like prill urea. Prill urea is kind of pellet that also can release and increase the use of nitrogen very efficiently. Will also reduce the emission. Well, of course, at the beginning, I think we might need to apply certain of fertilizer for that. But I think we also can use the nitrogen fixing type of crop, many crops that also fixing the nitrogen, also putting back into the crop residues into that. And there are also many innovation. For example, the black soldier flies is also kind of flies that can also produce very high content of nitrogen when they decompose the crop residues, especially for the food waste. So now actually in Indonesia, there are many also farmers already introduced into this kind of technology. So they also reduce quite significant amount of fertilizers being used. Seeing this number of approach that can be done, of course, introducing the farmers with kind of technologies is also a problem. For example, now there are in some of areas actually the use of nitrogen fertilizers or the over dosage, and then when they use in organic farming, for example, they are not patient to wait, because normally when the soil is already applied with a large amount of nitrogen fertilizer, needs some time to restore that. So it's mean when they apply the organic farming, so it might be 2 to 3 years. The yield will recover and get high yield again. So waiting for 2 and 3 years is also another problem for the farmers, because changing from the using the synthetic fertilizer, moving into organic farming, also can reduce the yield for some time. But after that, they can again back after the soil condition improve because of applying the organic matters into the soils. So I think that's some of the possible approach that can be done for avoiding or limiting the use of nitrogen fertilizer.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, time has already passed 9 o'clock in Japan, so I will have to close this session. So these food issues and energy issues are the core to achieve the decarbonized society. But we are now facing the many issues toward the decarbonized, and also, from the viewpoint of the social issues, including COVID-19 and Russians issues. So so we must consider all issues. And as Tomoko mentioned, the early actions is quite important. And so from this discussion, I'd like to correct the many opinion of the solutions. And so we show the more the sophisticated to be the more realistic solution. Okay, thank you very much for the all speakers and discussants. And I'm so sorry that I couldn't keep the time to reply to the questions from the followers. But I hope, in the near future, we'd like to have this kind of sessions or issues to discuss with all the participants. Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.